Okay, good morning. I think we'll start. So I'd like to first conclude the proof that we started last week. So we already proved that the finite volume pressure converges pointwise to some infinite volume quantity. And we did that for arbitrary sequences of boxes that grow to ZD in the sense of Van Hove, and for arbitrary sequences of boundary conditions. But there were two additional claims that were made in the theorem that I have not yet proved. And these are the fact that the limiting pressure is convex and it's even. So let me just briefly do that. So convexity of the limiting pressure, well, it's essentially trivial because the pointwise limit of we have seen that the finite volume pressures are convex and pointwise limit of convex functions are convex. But let me just do it. So fix some alpha between 0 and 1, and then the only thing we want to check is that so we know that in finite volume we have alpha beta 1 plus 1 minus alpha beta 2 alpha h1 plus 1 minus alpha h2. We know that this is always smaller. We have proved this last week. Smaller than alpha psi beta 1 h1 plus 1 minus alpha psi beta 2 h2. But then, by the pointwise convergence that we proved last week, this quantity it converges to psi, this quantity converges to psi, this quantity it converges to psi. Therefore, psi satisfies the same inequality, and this means that psi is convex. Okay, it's really completely empty. The argument for the fact that that psi is even in H, so the function H goes to psi of beta H is even, is essentially identical because we saw that it's true for finite volume pressure. So psi lambda say whatever empty set of beta H is equal to beta minus H. That was one of these exercises I stated last week. And then for the same reason as above, pointwise convergence means that this function converges to psi, this sequence of function converges to psi, therefore psi is also even in H. Okay, and this concludes the proof of this theorem. And now I would like to go back a little bit to some notions I introduced last week. So as I said, we are only interested in the pressure in this class as a tool, as a technical tool that will give us some information about the magnetization density, which is really the quantity we are interested in. So let me go back to this. So we have seen last week, well, first that the magnetization density was defined as it was a function. So in magnetization density in the box lambda, finite set lambda with boundary condition sharp at beta h was defined as the expected value of m lambda with respect to the corresponding Gibbs measure. So beta h, okay, where I remind you that m lambda was just the random variable which gives you the average spin in the box. Okay. That's what we saw. And moreover, we saw that this quantity, this average magnetization density in the box lambda, was related to the pressure, the finite volume pressure in lambda, as follows. It was given by the derivative with respect to h of the finite volume pressure. Okay, this also we showed last week. Now, a question that will play a very important role in the sequel is whether an analog of this identity, let me call it star, whether there is a version of star that still holds for the limiting pressure. So is it possible to take the limit as lambda goes to ZD on both sides of this identity to get to be in such a way that we can express an infinite volume magnetization density as the derivative of the infinite volume pressure that we already constructed, right? So the main question I want to address now is, does there exist a version of star in the thermodynamic limit? So this question, whether this exists, it's really two different questions that are, of course, related to each other, but there are really 2 points that I would like to emphasize. The first is whether this quantity, this finite volume magnetization density, admits a limit as lambda goes to ZD. So does the limit as lambda goes to ZD in the sense of 1/2 of m lambda sharp beta h exist? If yes, is it independent of the sequence lambda that we use and of the boundary condition? Okay, so that's the first question. Can you make sense of the limit of the left-hand side? But then even if we can make sense of the limit of the quantity in the left-hand side, is it still true that it's related to the infinite volume pressure by an analog of star, which you can write as follow? So yeah, maybe let me do it this way. So dH of the limiting pressure, psi, this is something that we can write as ddh of the limit as lambda goes to ZD of the finite volume pressure, right, by definition of psi. Okay. On the other hand, if I want this to be true, so I'm assuming that in some sense the limit does exist, so maybe I do it this way. So m beta h, or n, seen as a limit, so let's assume that this holds, as ZD, lambda goes to ZD of the finite volume magnetization density. So this would be the limit as lambda goes to ZD. By star, I can write the finite volume magnetization density as a derivative of the finite volume pressure. And if you want to have an analog of star valid for these two quantities, so if you want these two quantities to be equal, well, you need these two quantities to be equal, so you need to be able to interchange the derivative with respect to h in the thermodynamic limit. So you need to interchange these two operations. So is it possible to interchange the derivative with respect to h and the limit as lambda goes to ZD? So these are all questions that we will have to address, and the answer will turn out not to be trivial, right? It will not always be possible to do that. It's not always the case that the limit here exists and has the nice property we want, and so on and so forth. So the answers are much more subtle than they are for the pressure. Pressure is a very robust quantity. These quantities are less robust. And what is really at the core of all these matters is whether or not the limiting pressure here is actually differentiable. Okay, that will be really the core of what we are going to analyze. Okay. Nevertheless, even though this will take us some time to understand completely, and it's not trivial, there are a lot of information that we can already extract for free from the fact that psi exists, as we have shown, and that it's convex, as we have shown. Just these two information are already enough to prove to answer these questions almost everywhere, for almost all values of h. Okay? And this is what I would like to explain now. So maybe let me first remind you of some properties of convex functions of one real variable. So just some parentheses about that function. So I'm assuming that I have a function f from R to R, which is convex. Okay. Then we have the following properties. Let me denote by d plus f the right derivative. Of f, and d minus f the left derivative of f. Okay. Then we can state the following points. I number them the same way they are numbered in the book, so that you can find proofs there if you really want to. So in the book it's theorem B12. It's really completely elementary. The proof of all the points I will give here are all done in a couple of lines, but if you are interested in seeing them, it's done in the appendix. So the first thing is that these two quantities, the right and left derivative, they exist at all points. Okay? So d plus f and d minus f exist for all, or at all x in R. That's the first thing, so they are always well defined. This I don't need. I need the next one I need is 4, which tells you that they have some nice properties. So d plus f and d minus f are both non-decreasing. Then point 5 tells you that d plus f is a right continuous function. While d minus f is left continuous. Then I need the fact that, so as we have seen by point 1, the right and left derivative exist at all points, so the function f will be differentiable at x if d plus f is equal to d minus f, if its right and left derivative coincide. And the point is that this must occur almost everywhere. In a very strong sense, it must occur everywhere outside an at most countable set. So let me just write this. So the set of all point x in R such that d plus f of x is not equal to d minus f of x. So the point of non-differentiability of the function f is at most countable. And finally, the last result I need is that if you have a sequence of convex functions, so let Gn be a sequence of convex functions from R to R, which converge pointwise to a convex function G, such that for all x in R, Gn of x converges to g of x. Okay. So assume that. Automatically g is convex by the argument we saw earlier. Okay. Then we're interested in what can we say about the limit of the derivative. So let's assume that the limiting function is differentiable at some point x. So assume, maybe I'll continue on another blackboard so that we have more space. Okay, so assume G is differentiable at some point x in R, then the derivative of g of at x is the limit as n goes to infinity of the derivative of gn at x, except that gn, I have not assumed anything about differentiability of gn. The only thing I know is that gn is convex, so maybe it's not differentiable at x, but for sure it possesses right and left derivative at x, so I can use that instead. So what I can guarantee is that this is the same as the limit of d plus gn at x, and I can also use, if I prefer, equivalent, the limit of d minus gn at x. Okay, so that concludes all these things that I wanted to recall here. So these are standard properties of convex functions that we can apply to the particular convex function we have, which is the infinite volume pressure. Okay. And I want to see what this tells us. So in our case, convexity of the function h goes to psi of beta h immediately implies a number of nice properties. Well, the first is that the left and right derivative of the limiting pressure do exist. So we don't know if psi is differentiable, but it has at least right and left derivative. So d plus h, so d plus h is the right derivative with respect to h, okay, of psi beta h, and d minus h of psi at beta h exist for any beta and for any h. Okay, these are quantities that always exist. So at least we have this. We don't know yet whether we can really differentiate, but at least we have left and right derivative. Now the question of whether psi is differentiable at h reduces to the question whether the left and right derivative coincide. So we can introduce the set of all values of h at which these two quantities coincide. Let me do that. So for any beta, let's introduce the set b beta, which is the set of all bad values of h. So that will be the set of all h in R, such that psi is not differentiable as a function of h, not differentiable with respect to h. All the points at which it's not differentiable with respect to h. Okay? Which is the same by the fact that these two quantities exist. It's the same as the set of all h in R, such that d plus h psi beta h is different from d minus h psi beta h. Okay. So this is a set on which we don't yet know much about what is actually happening, but outside this set we will be able to answer all these questions. Okay? And it's already very good because this set is very small. So as we saw, this set is at most countable. We will prove later that it's much better than countable. It contains either 0 points, it's empty, or it contains just the origin. But that's for later. For the moment, we know at least that it's at most countable. This comes from this point 6 in the properties I've listed before, by point 6. Okay. So now I want to show that we can answer these questions that I've raised earlier outside of this set B beta. And that's corollary 3.7. Let's do the following. So let's fix some h which is not in B beta. So let's do it like that. For any h not in this bad set, the average magnetization density, which I will denote M of beta H, which is defined as the thermodynamic limit of the finite volume average magnetization density. So it's the limit as lambda increases to z in the sense of Van Hove of M lambda sharp of beta H. This quantity is well defined, so the limit exists. And it does not depend on the sequence lambda that I've chosen, provided it satisfies this type of convergence, and on the boundary condition. And does not depend on lambda and the boundary condition. Okay, first thing, so the limit exists. It also satisfies M of beta H is equal to the derivative of the infinite volume pressure at beta H. Let me call this star star. So that's the analog of this finite volume identity we had between the average magnetization density in lambda and the derivative of the pressure in lambda with respect to the magnetic field. So we have the same in infinite volume, but outside this set of bad values. Okay? So all this is outside the set of bad values. Moreover, we know more than that. We can deduce more from the convexity. Moreover, we have the following properties. So seen as a function of h, this quantity, this average magnetization density, is so non-decreasing. It's non-decreasing on R minus B beta, so wherever it's defined. Okay. It's also continuous at all h which are not in B beta. Okay. And it's discontinuous at all h which are in B beta. Discontinuous at each h in B beta, and we can be a bit more precise about what happens at a bad value of h, at one at which the pressure is not differentiable, in the sense that we can see what replaces this star star in this case. Okay, so that's what I want to state now. Just take some chalk. Okay. Okay. So n, again, for all h in B beta, so for each bad values of the magnetic field, we have that the limit as, say, h prime decreases to this value h, take a sequence of decreasing values of the magnetic field that converges to h, of the magnetization density m beta h prime, then this converges to d plus h psi beta h. So you replace this identity by an identity where you only have, if you come from the right, you get the right derivative, and of course if you come from the left, if h prime increases to h, you get the left derivative. Okay. And there is indeed a discontinuity because these two guys are not equal. By assumption, if you are in B beta, these two guys are not equal. That means that these two limits are not equal. Okay, so you get a discontinuity. Okay, so I'm almost done with the statement. The proof will be much shorter. The statement is a bit long. the last part in this statement is about the existence of what we call the spontaneous magnetization in the first lecture. That is what remains of the magnetization of your sample once you have removed the magnetic field. So in particular, the spontaneous magnetization which is defined as m star of beta, which is the limit as h decreases to 0 of m of beta h, always exists. By this result that we have above. It's just a particular case. Okay, but that's a quantity which will play a very important role for us because it's the one that will determine whether the behavior is paramagnetic or ferromagnetic. Okay? This quantity encodes this information. Okay, so that was a bit long to state, but let's see that actually it's very short to prove. Proof. I will prove all this at the same time. So let's start with, so let's take h, which is not in B beta, take a good value, and look at the derivative of the infinite volume pressure with respect to h. It exists because h is not in B beta. Now, by definition of psi, this is derivative with respect to h of the limit as lambda increases to zd in the sense of Van Hove of some finite volume pressure, psi lambda h, sharp. Okay. I'm not indicating beta and h, but everything is taken at beta h, of course. So we have this, and then now these are convex functions, as I mentioned already. Okay. These are convex functions, so I have a sequence of convex functions. I'm looking at the derivative of the pointwise limit of a sequence of convex functions, but we have seen that this is the same as the limit of the derivatives. Okay, so that's the limit. So that was by point 6, I think. Let me check. No, 7. 0.7 in the list I gave before. So if you have sequence of convex functions converging pointwise, the limiting function is differentiable at the point you're interested in, then its differential is given, its derivative is given by the limit of the derivative. So I have this and ddh psi lambda sharp, but this by star, that's just the average magnetization density in lambda, so this is equal by star limit lambda goes to zd m lambda sharp of beta h again. Okay. So I've proven what? I've proven that this limit exists. It's given by d psi dh. So it proves the existence and the fact that it satisfies star star. And moreover, since the left-hand side here does not depend on the sequence of boxes chosen or on the boundary condition used, it's in the limit here is also independent of both. So this proves all these statements. So it exists, it does not depend on anything, and it satisfies star star. Okay, so all this we have done. So what remains to be done are only these few points there. And that's comes almost for free. Again, thanks to these properties that I've listed. So now, again, let's look at the function h, which goes to m of beta h, and I'm looking at it at h which take good values, so outside the set b beta. Then, so for any monotonicity, so the fact that it's non-decreasing, monotonicity of h m beta h on r minus B beta follows from star star. So we know that at each point of the complement of B beta, we have that the magnetization density is equal to the derivative of psi. But if it's equal to the derivative of psi, it's equal at the same time to the right derivative and the left derivative of psi because they coincide. But we have one of the statements I made, I don't know, 4 or 3. It's actually 4. Statement 4 follows from tells you that the right and left derivative are both non-decreasing. Okay, so necessarily this function is also non-decreasing. And the fact that it's continuous, so continuity of the function h goes to m beta h at each point h which is not in B beta follows by the same argument. It follows from star star, which identifies again m with the derivative of psi. So m coincides with both the left and right derivative of psi at h. The left derivative is left continuous, the right derivative is right continuous. So this function has to be at the same time left and right continuous, so it's continuous. And that was point 5. Okay. So these two things are for free. It follows immediately from these properties of convex functions. So the only thing that remains to be checked is that the function n is discontinuous at each h in B beta, and actually I will prove directly this stronger statement, which is here. I will only prove one of the two because they are completely symmetric. I will prove the first one. Okay. So let's do that, and this will conclude the proof of this corollary. Okay. So now let's take some point h in B beta, so a bad value. I want to show that the function is discontinuous there. Let's consider a sequence hk that decreases to h, and I'm assuming that hk does not belong to B beta for any k. This I can do because the set B beta is at most countable, so it's possible to always avoid the points of B beta. The complement of B beta is dense in the real numbers, right? So I can find a sequence hk that decreases to h such that none of the hk is a bad value of the magnetic field. Okay. So that's what I want to do. And then, then we just look at what we want there. So we want the limit as hk decreases to h of m of beta hk. It's well defined because hk again is a point which is not bad. Okay. Now, decreases to h by star star. This magnetization at hk, I can write it as the derivative with respect to h of psi beta hk, which is of course the same thing as the right derivative. If I want, doesn't change anything because it coincides with its right derivative at hk. Okay. But then I use the last point I've not yet used of this list of properties, which is the fact that, or actually I used it here, the fact that the right derivative is right continuous. That was point 5. By right continuity of this quantity, this necessarily is equal to d plus h psi beta h by right continuity. Okay, and this concludes the proof of this corollary. So as you can see, the proof is pretty easy application of these properties of convex function that I've stated. But it already provides you with quite a lot of information about the possible behavior of the magnetization density. It's only qualitative information at the moment. We will need some more work to be able to make it more quantitative, but it's already something, and it comes for free. So what we are able to say at this stage is the following. Let me do it like that. So that's H, and that's M, H. Then what we know is that there is a set at most countable. Let me draw it. So maybe that's one point of the set. The function is odd. So the function M is odd because psi is even, and the derivative of an even function is an odd function. So you have something like that, maybe another point there. So these points are the points in B beta. These are the bad values. Okay, that's B beta, all these guys. Okay. Then on this set of bad values, the function is discontinuous, and overall it's increasing or non-decreasing, and continuous everywhere else. So it looks something like that, and it's odd. So you get something of this type. Okay, the picture is not very good, but I hope you can see what happens. So these are the kind of behavior that we can expect at this stage. Okay, something of this type. Now what we will see, we will show in any dimension equal to 2 or more, there will exist a beta C, which is non-trivial, such that the following will be true. Actually, the set B beta will be the empty set for all beta smaller than beta C, and it will be 0 for all beta larger than beta C. Okay. Actually, it's also the empty set at beta C, but I will not prove it. What happens at the critical point I will not address in this lecture. You will see that in the second semester in Hugo's lectures. Okay, so that's what we will show. So it shows that the picture is much simpler than that. The picture actually is either beta is smaller than beta C and the set of bad points is empty, which means that your function is continuous. It's odd, it's continuous, so it looks something like that. And the other possibility is that beta is larger than beta C, and then the only point where you have a bad value, a discontinuity of the function M, is 0, and therefore you have a picture like that, which is exactly what we would like to prove, right? It's either the behavior is paramagnetic or it's ferromagnetic. Okay. But to prove that, I need some tools. Okay, it's not clear how to get information about whether this function psi is differentiable at a point h or not. Of course, the most natural way to proceed would be to compute psi. If you were able to compute the pressure in infinite volume, then you just look where it's differentiable and where it's not, and then you have the full answer. The problem is that you cannot compute the pressure. Nobody knows how to do that, except in dimension 1. You have done it in dimension 1. And the result is not very exciting, dimension 1, because psi is analytic at all h. So you are always in this setting. Dimension 1, you are always paramagnetic. There is no ferromagnetic regime. Okay? So it's not very exciting. And that's the only case where you can actually compute things. You can compute the pressure. I mean, you can make some computation in dimension 2, but only for magnetic field equal to 0. So it does not give you any information about differentiability with respect to h. Okay. So we need something else. And let me explain what we need to, what are the tools that we are going to use. And that's the notion of infinite volume states. But just before I do that, maybe I should just provide you with the first definition of a phase transition. It's a good place to do that. Now I can give a precise definition of what I mean by a phase transition. So first definition of first order phase transition. First order phase transition looking at this picture, the only place where you, the places where you would like to say that you have a phase transition are all these, the places where you have this singular behavior, so discontinuous behavior of the magnetization, or which is equivalent, you have non-differentiability of the pressure. Okay, so that's the first definition we are going to use. It's definition 3.8 in the book. Tells you the following. So the pressure psi exhibits a first order phase transition at beta h if the function h goes to psi of beta h is not differentiable at h. Okay. Or at beta h. But as a function of h. Okay. So that's the definition. It's of course equivalent. This is equivalent to having h in b beta. Okay. The same thing. So we are going to see another, it's a first definition because we are going to see a second definition later, next week, I guess. And you will see that the second definition is more probabilistic. This is an analytic definition. You have some function, which we defined last week. And it's a question about differentiability properties of this function. And then we will see a probabilistic definition and we will show that they are equivalent, these two definitions. It will be non-trivial to show that. It will require some work. Okay, so now that I've defined this, I can move on to this notion of infinite volume Gibbs states. So we have been able to take the thermodynamic limit of the pressure, which allowed us, at least to some extent, to get the thermodynamic limit of the magnetization density, at least outside this set B beta. And for the rest, we will need to extract more information than just about the magnetization, and this is done by defining, in a sense, thermodynamic limit of probability measure. We have this finite volume Gibbs measure, which are defined in finite volume lambda with some given boundary condition. And again, I can try to construct a sequence of such probability measure with lambda growing and growing. Maybe I can define in this way some limiting measure on the whole space. And that's the kind of things we want to discuss here. So it's 3-4. Infinite volume Gibbs states. Okay. I just give a motivation and then we'll make up the break. Okay. So motivation will be the following. So here is my sample, that's my system, that's lambda, which I assume to be very big. Okay. Outside lambda I have some boundary condition, which is whatever. Then I'm going to take a small observation window. So I'm going to observe some local properties. Up to now, we have looked at the pressure and the magnetization density, which are global properties. They take the whole system into account. Okay. Now we are looking at some local properties. So I take a small observation window here. Which I assume to be very far from the boundary of the box. So it's a distance r. I'm assuming r is very large. Okay. Then in this observation window, I'm going to observe some quantity. So I have some observable, some function, f from omega to r, some random variable, which lives inside this small observation window. So f is there. It's living there. And I'm going to observe f. For example, I could measure the expected value of f inside this window. So I'm looking at the expected value of f in the box lambda with this boundary condition, sharp. Okay. Now, I might hope that if r is very large, the value that I will get for this expectation will not depend very much on the shape of the box lambda or on the boundary condition chosen, maybe. So maybe I will get something like some universal value, f, plus some error term with this guy vanishing as r goes to infinity. So if you take lambda bigger and bigger so that the distance between the boundary of the box and the support of the function f diverges, then maybe you get the convergence of this type. So this guy would be much more universal than this one. Let me put quotation mark because you will see that there are many subtleties there. But this is the kind of things we would like to have. So we'd like to have a part which does not depend on the shape of the box, which in some sense does not depend or not too strongly on the boundary conditions, and then some vanishing error term. Is it possible to do a decomposition like that in order to extract the relevant information? In the same way that we did for the pressure. Let me maybe just make this last comment before the break. And it's what we proved last week and today for the magnetization is the following. So again, we took a sample, lambda, that was our big piece of iron or nickel or whatever. Here it's a piece of Ising model. And so we have this big chunk of Ising model. And then we showed that the pressure in lambda with some boundary condition sharp outside. This was given by some function psi, which was the limiting pressure in infinite volume, in the thermodynamic limit, plus some small error. Actually, it was of order boundary of lambda divided by volume of lambda. Okay? If you look at the proof we did last week, okay? So we have vanishing error term. So this was a universal quantity which does not depend on the box, does not depend on the boundary condition. And that's the physically relevant quantity because, again, if you have a small sample of iron and you open your table with the properties of various materials, in particular, you look at the page where they describe the properties of iron. The properties of iron do not depend on the shape of the piece of iron you have in your hand. Okay? Does not depend on the total size, doesn't depend on anything of this type. It's just a property of iron as some universal quantity. Okay? And that's exactly the kind of thing we want to extract here. These are things which depend on the geometry, and they are not as fundamental as this part. Okay? So that's what we did, and we also proved that if you do the same for the magnetization, you get n plus small of 1. Let me not be too precise here, where again, m was some universal quantity which did not depend on lambda or the boundary condition, and that was for NEH, but that was for NEH not in d beta. So there was some constraint for the magnetization, there were no constraint for the pressure, and that's the kind of thing you proved. So now we would like to have something similar, but for general observation that have the property of being local. So I'm just going to observe what happens in a small window here, far away from the boundary, and I would like also to get some universal behavior, to extract some universal behavior. Okay, that's what we will be discussing after the break. Okay, we'll start again. So now we'd like to make this picture clear by introducing relevant definitions. So the first thing I would like to make more precise is what I mean by a local observation made somewhere in my system. Okay? So that's definition 311. So I take a function f, so random variable f. Okay? Now we say that this function f is local if the value that f takes only depends on a finite number of spins. So the spins located in a finite set of the lattice. So if there exists some finite set delta, say, in VD, such that if I have two, for any pairs of configuration omega and omega tilde, say, which are such that omega I is equal to omega tilde I for all I in delta, so if they coincide in this particular finite set delta, then the value that f takes at omega and omega tilde coincide. So f the omega is f omega tilde. Okay, that's the definition of being local. Okay. Only depends on finitely many spins. Maybe let me just write also this here. So among all these sets delta, there is the smallest one. And the smallest one, I will call it the support of the function f. So the smallest such set delta is called the support of f. And denoted sup f. Okay. Good. So that's the notion of local function. So when I'm saying that I'm making a local observation far away from the boundary of the set, what I mean is that I'm looking at a local function whose support is far away from the boundary of the box lambda. Okay, that's the first thing. So some example of local functions, right, two examples of local function. The first, most trivial one, is the spin at the origin. So sigma 0 is local. And the support of sigma 0 is just 0. It only depends on the value of the configuration at 0. Okay. Another example, which is almost as trivial, is the magnetization in a cubic box. So if I'm looking at M Bn, which is, again, so say 1 over Bn, some I in Bn, sigma I, this is also a local function. And its support is just Bn. It only depends on the value of the spins inside the box. Okay, so these are two examples of local functions. So these local functions will play an extremely important role in what I'm going to say. Maybe let me stress already now some abuse of notation that I will be doing quite many times, abuse of notation, which is very convenient, so I will do it pretty often. It's the following. So if I have f, a local function, okay, and so take omega, a configuration which is defined only on the support of f. Okay, support of f is some finite set. Take configuration omega, which tells me what are the values of the spin on the support of f. That's already enough information to compute f. Right? It only depends on what happens on its support. So it's enough information. So now I can define f of omega. In principle, f as before. So f is a function from the infinite configuration to R. Okay? So it does not take as an input a function which is only defined on the support of f, but I will still define this as being f of omega tilde for any omega tilde infinite configuration such that omega tilde I coincide with omega I for all I in the support of f. Okay. It does not depend on the choice of omega tilde you make because f is local. Okay. So that's an abuse of notation that will be very, very useful. So I will do it. Okay, more interestingly, let me now define the notion of a state, of infinite volume state. Definition 313. Okay. So an infinite volume state, what I will call only just state in the sequence. So state is a mapping which goes from the set of all local functions to R. It takes in a local function, outputs a number, and which satisfies three properties. The first property is that it's normalized. If you take the function which is the function 1, so the function which is identically equal to 1, I should write the state. So let me write it. The mapping is a mapping that I will denote. Okay. Is a mapping that I will denote like that. So it goes from the local functions to R, and to a local function f, it associates some quantity that I will denote f between brackets, and I will call the average of f in the state. So that's the average of f in the state. Okay. That's just my notation. So I want such a mapping which satisfies the following. So it's normalized. If I compute the average of the function 1, I get 1. If I compute the average of a non-negative function f, it's non-negative. And it's linear. Okay? So that's the definition of an infinite volume state. We are not going to be interested in general states like that. We're going to be interested in a particular subset of all these states, which are related to finite volume Gibbs distribution that we saw last week in the following sense. So maybe I do it elsewhere because it will take a bit of space. Okay, so definition 314. Okay. So consider a sequence lambda n that grows to ZD. Okay. Not necessarily in the sense of Van Hove, just a sequence growing to ZD. Take a sequence of boundary conditions also. Okay. Sequence of boundary conditions. Now we will say that the sequence of finite volume Gibbs distribution mu lambda n beta h sharp n. So this sequence, where I use this sequence of boxes and this sequence of boundary conditions, so I have a sequence of finite volume Gibbs distributions, then we will say that this sequence converges to the state, to a particular state, if the following is true. We want that the expected value of any local function f in the Gibbs measure lambda n beta h sharp converges, that's a sequence of real numbers, so converges to the average of f in the state that I'm considering. Okay, and that has to be true for any f local. That notion of a sequence of Gibbs distribution that converges to a particular state, and then a state which is constructed in this way, so a state which has the property that it's the limit of a sequence of finite volume Gibbs distribution is what is called the Gibbs state. So is then called the Gibbs state. So that's exactly what I wanted, right? I have this sequence. I'm making this local observation f in my box lambda n with some boundary condition. That now I take a box which is big enough. So I take n large enough here. So I have a big enough box lambda n. That means that I'm pushing the boundary of lambda n far away from the support of f. Okay? Then this stabilizes. It converges to this. So when n is large enough, this stabilizes to some particular deterministic value, which is the average of f in this state. Okay, so that's the universal part I wanted to extract, and the rest is just corrections. Okay, so whenever this occurs, I have realized the program I sketched in the blackboard before. Okay, now it's not clear at all that you can do that. You can actually construct sequence of Gibbs distribution in lambda n with some boundary condition that actually converge in this sense. We will have to do something, but that is certainly the kind of thing we would like to have. Okay. Okay. So maybe a few remarks. The first remark is for those of you who are familiar with the Riesz-Markov-Kakutani representation theorem. So those who are familiar, they know that there is into each state in the sense that is written here. So any function from this set of local functions to the real numbers that satisfy this normalization condition, positivity and linearity, I can associate in a unique way probability measure on omega. So I can associate mu, a probability measure on omega with the product sigma algebra, such that for any local function, I have that the average of f under the state is actually just the expected value of f with respect to the probability measure mu. Okay. So that's the thing, first thing. So in a sense, I could, if I wanted, instead of talking about states, I could just talk about probability measures on omega. It's the same object. Okay? But it turns out that it's less technical. We need much less functional analysis working with states than working with probability measure on omega, so I will work with states. Okay, in this chapter. This theorem is proved in the book. It's all these things about infinite volume measures are discussed in this chapter 6 I mentioned already. Okay, if you want to see this, it's explained there. But I would like to make a second remark associated to this. If you take this point of view, then I can see this definition of a Gibbs state, infinite volume Gibbs state, as saying that then stating that some particular sequence of expectation converges to some particular state, exactly what I defined here, so stating this kind of things. So when I write that, I mean that the expectation is taken for all local functions. I'm just writing it this way. So when I write that, this is actually equivalent to the fact that the corresponding probability measures weakly converge to this measure mu. So it's a weak convergence of probability measure. Okay, I will not say anything more about it. It's just for those who know these things and want to make the connection. So this definition here, which might look a bit strange, it's actually completely equivalent to weak convergence of probability measures if you are in this setting. Okay. For those who don't know, I'm not going to use anything about what is written here, so you can forget about it right now. Okay. So now, the basic question at this stage is it possible to construct sequence of finite volume Gibbs measures that converge to a state in the limit? So is it possible to construct Gibbs states? Okay. When do such objects exist? So I'm going to provide one theorem that we will prove. We will not prove it immediately. I will need to introduce a few tools. I will do that today, and then we will prove existence next week. We will prove the theorem itself next week. Okay. And then I will state an exercise which is much more general but non-constructive. So let me answer this question first in a constructive way. So theorem 317. So fix some beta and h Okay. Then there exist two states, which I will denote plus beta h and minus beta h, such that the following is true. For any, let me do it like that. For any sequence lambda n that increases to ZD, the expected value with respect to, let me put, plus lambda n beta h converges to the average of f under this state here. And the same for the minus boundary condition. Lambda n beta h converges to f minus beta h. And this is, of course, for all local function f. All local function f. Okay? So what this, the theorem is not over now, but what this tells you at the moment is that whatever sequence of boundary condition of volume you choose, if you use the plus boundary condition outside, this sequence of expected value that you will get always converges to something. Okay? And the same with minus boundary condition. So you can define states corresponding to the limit, thermodynamic limit with plus or minus boundary conditions. These states are called the plus state and minus state. They are extremely important in this theory. We'll see why. Okay. And moreover, they have some nice properties that I want to state now. Some additional nice property. Namely, or moreover, these two states are translation invariant. I have to explain what this means. Just wait a second. Are translation invariant. Okay, that's the end of the statement. So what do I mean by translation invariant state? Remember that we are defining everything on the lattice ZD. So there is a natural translation operation that is defined in the lattice, which I can call theta j. So for any j in ZD, I can denote by theta j the translation I goes to I plus j. Okay. And define the translation. Now, this translation, I can also make it act in a trivial way on configurations. So I can define also theta j. I can make it act on omega. And I take a configuration, say, omega, which is just omega I in ZD. And I send it to the configuration theta j of omega, which is such that theta j omega at a vertex I, by definition, it's omega of I minus j. Okay. Okay. So I have this notion of translation that I can see either as translation on the lattice, so take a point and translate the point, or take a configuration and translate the configuration back in the other direction. Right? So that's one thing. And then once I have that, I can define what it means for a state to be translation invariant. It will be something very natural. If a state is translation invariant and I'm measuring some quantity here, or I'm measuring the same quantity translated elsewhere on the lattice, I get the same expected value. Okay? The expected value of a function does not it depends on the function, but not on where I'm translating its support. Okay? So let me state it now. So definition 3.16 will say that a state is translation invariant if the expected value of f the average value of f in this state is the same as the average value of f composed with theta j in the state for any f local and any j in Z. Okay? So expected value of a function does not change if I'm translating the support of the function over the lattice. Okay? So these two states, plus and minus, they have this property of being translation invariant. Now, a very important point, and you will see that it's really at the heart of what we are discussing, I'm not actually claiming that these states, this plus state and this minus states, are two states. They could very well be the same state. Okay? Whether or not these two states coincide or not is some very important question that we will have to address, and it will be closely related to differentiability of the pressure. Okay, we'll see why. Okay? So it's not, a priori, it's not, I'm not claiming that these two states are different. So it could very well be that for any local function, the expected value of f under the plus state is the same as the expected value of f under the minus state, in which case it's the same state that I'm talking about. Okay? So whether or not they coincide is something that we will discuss, but it's not something that is obvious. It will depend on the temperature, it will depend on the dimension. Okay? So it's not really non-trivial. Good. This I've said. Okay, an exercise that you will do in the next exercise sheet. It's that, so this shows you that at least for some particular boundary condition, this plus and minus boundary condition, fortunately they are very important ones, so they are useful, so the statement is very useful. So for this particular boundary condition, you can constructively prove existence of some limiting states, Gibbs states. Now, it turns out that you can also use compactness argument to prove existence of subsequential limits in complete generality. So I want just to state this as an exercise, and you will do it by yourself. So it will, let's assume that we have an arbitrary sequence of boundary condition eta n. Okay. Boundary conditions, so configurations. Okay. We have also a sequence lambda n, which grows to ZD. And then there exists, okay, I'm looking now at the sequence of probability measure, mu lambda n, beta h, eta n. I'm looking at this probability measure. Then this a priori does not converge. I mean, in some cases it will, in many cases, in most cases it won't converge. But it's possible to extract a subsequence from this measure. So there exists a subsequence nk such that the subsequence mu lambda nk beta h eta nk converges to some state, some Gibbs state. Okay. So it's always possible to prove subsequential convergence by just some compactness argument. Of course, it's non-constructive. You have no information from that about the limiting state, but it exists. So any sequence of finite volume Gibbs distribution for the Ising model will give rise to many cluster points, all of which will be Gibbs states. Okay, good. But for our purposes, these two states, these plus and minus states, will be enough. We'll be able to prove everything we want just using the two. These two. One can actually say a lot of things about the set of all possible Gibbs states of the model. It's also interesting in the other direction. What is the total set of all possible Gibbs states? That's also something that is discussed in chapter 6, but I will not have time to discuss it here. So now if you look at the definition of a Gibbs state, which is not there anymore, remember that you have to check convergence of the expectation of all local functions. It's nasty because there are many local functions. Okay, it's annoying to have to check this convergence for all possible local functions. So it would be very nice if there was some restricted set of local functions, much simpler set of local functions, on which it was sufficient to check convergence. Okay? And that's what I want to discuss now. We'll give you two such families. So two families of local functions that will generate all the other local functions. Okay. So let me introduce them. So remember that we have the spin at I. This I already used many times. Now I want to introduce a new random variable which is localized at I, which is a change of variables compared to this one. I will call it Ni. It's the occupation number at I. And it's defined as 1 plus sigma I over 2. Okay. So essentially it's just telling you that when sigma is equal to plus you get 1, and when sigma is minus you get 0. It's just a trivial remapping of the plus and minuses to 1 and zeros, but it's a very important one, as you will see. Then, so these are these two quantities, and then we can define for any finite set A in ZD, I can define the following random variables. So one will be sigma sub A. Sigma sub A is defined as the product over all the spins in A of sigma I. Not the sum this time, I really want the product. Okay. And then I can define the same way n sub A as the product over all I in A of Ni. Okay. These are well-defined local functions. All these are local functions. Well-defined local functions. Now it turns out that these two families, so the family sigma A for all A in ZD and Na for all A in ZD, they generate all other local functions. Each generates all local functions. I want to explain that now. Okay. But this will be very useful because, as we will see, this means that if I'm able to show that expectation value of these guys converge, then I have convergence for all local functions. The same if I'm able to show a convergence of expected value of these guys, then I have convergence for all local functions. So this will be enough to check convergence to a limiting deep state. And the reason it's so convenient is that these two classes of local functions, they have very special properties. We will see that there are some inequalities that are satisfied by expectation of such quantities that makes the analysis, the proof of the existence of the limit much, much simpler. Okay. But this we will probably do next week, we'll see. Let me first explain why they generate all local functions. So that's lemma 319. Okay. So let f be a local function. Then there exists a sequence of coefficients f at A with A in the support of f, so the set of all subsets of the support, which is a finite set. The support of f is finite because f is local. You take the set of all its subsets, and to each subset you associate some coefficient f hat of A. So there exists this. There exists also another one, which I will denote by f tilde of A, also indexed by the subsets of the support of f, such that, so these are just sequence of numbers, such that f is actually equal to the sum over all A in the support of f at A sigma A. It's also equal to the sum over all A in the support of f tilde A and A. So indeed, take any local function, you can write it as a finite linear combination of sigma A or finite linear combination of Na. Okay? So let's prove this. It's quite easy. So the first thing I claim that the following is true. For any finite subset B of ZD, we have the following identity, 2 to the power minus the cardinality of B, so sum over all A in B, sigma A of omega sigma A of omega tilde, so take any omega tilde from infinite configurations, then this is always equal to the indicator that omega and omega tilde coincide on B. Omega I is equal to omega tilde I for all I in B. Okay? So that's a claim. Let me briefly prove it. It's very easy to prove. And then once we have this, it's obvious that this follows. Okay, so let's proof of the claim. So there are two cases. First case is when the indicator is equal to 1. So I'm assuming that omega I is equal to omega tilde I for all I in B. Okay. Then in that case, it immediately implies that the product omega I omega tilde I is equal to 1 for all I in B. Right? If they are equal, they are either both 1 or both minus 1, so the product is always 1. Okay. So now let's look at this sum. So we get 2 to the power minus B, sum over all A in B, sigma A omega sigma A omega tilde. Now let's look at the definition of these objects that I just gave a few minutes ago. Still written here. Okay. So that's just the product over all I in A omega I, and that's the product over all I in A omega tilde I. So what you get in the end is 2 to the power minus B, sum A in B, product over I in A omega I omega tilde I. But we have seen that this is equal to 1. So this is equal to 1. So what we get here is just the number of subsets of the set B, but that's 2 to the power B. So indeed you get 1. Okay. So for this first case, it's really trivial. So let's check the second case when omega tilde and omega do not coincide on B. There is at least one vertex in which they differ. The second case, there exists J in B such that omega I is different from omega J is different from omega tilde J. That's the second case. This immediately implies that the product omega J omega tilde J is equal to -1 because one has to be equal to 1, the other has to be equal to -1 because they are different, and then the product is -1. So let's see what is the conclusion. Take again this expression. I can forget about this because I want to prove that it's equal to 0 now. So the sum is enough. So I have the sum over all A in B, sigma A of omega, sigma A of omega tilde. This I can rewrite as follows. Oh, maybe a bit more space. I can write as sum over all A in B minus J. J is this particular vertex where they differ that I've selected. Okay. And then I have two contributions. I have sigma A omega sigma A omega tilde plus sigma A union J of omega sigma A union J of omega tilde. It's the same because this first sum gives me the sum over all subset A of B which do not contain J, and this second sum gives me the sum over all subsets A of B which do contain the vertex J. Okay, so I'm just writing a trivial identity. And now, this, by definition of this sigma A union G of omega and so on. That's just omega J, omega tilde J, sigma A of omega tilde. Okay. I've just taken out the contribution that in the product that comes from J. Okay. Which means that in the end, what do I have? I just have sum over all A in B minus J. Sigma A omega sigma A omega tilde times 1 plus omega J omega tilde J, but we have seen that omega J omega tilde J is minus 1, so that's 0. So you get 0. Okay? So the claim is proved, so this is indeed a true identity. Okay? So now let's check that this identity implies immediately the conclusion of the lemma. Okay. Then we have the following: f of omega. So I want to show that f can be written like that. And then I will write the second one. So f of omega is just by definition, I can write it as sum over all omega tilde in the support of f. All possible assignment of spins inside the support of the function f. F of omega tilde. And I put an indicator that restricts this sum to the only omega that I'm interested in, which is the one where omega I is equal to omega tilde I for all I in the support of f. Okay, so this sum has only one non-zero term, and it's f of omega. So okay. That's certainly an identity. But now, this indicator is exactly of this type. So I can apply this identity. So by the claim, this is nothing but the 2 to the power minus the support of f times the sum over all A in the support of f, sigma A of omega, sigma A of omega tilde. I'm just using this claim. But now I'm done because this is equal, I take out the sum over A, so sum over all A in the support of f. I will get something there. And then what I want is to have sigma A now. Okay? Because I want to prove this identity. Okay? So what do I have to do? So I have the sum over all omega tilde. I have this, so maybe first the constant 2 to the power minus the support of f. Then I have the sum over all omega tilde in omega sub f. And then I still have sigma A of omega tilde. So let's say sigma A of omega tilde, f of omega tilde. Okay. So this defines me f at A. Okay. Good. So this proves the first identity here. For the second one, it's essentially empty because what you can observe is the following: sigma A. I can always write it as, but okay, by definition, it's product over I in A sigma I, which is the product over all I in A of 2ni minus 1. But then I can expand the product. This gives me the sum over all C in A, 2 to the power C minus 1 to the power A minus C, and C. Okay. So that means that now I can take this expansion that we have in terms of the sigma A's. I replace each sigma A by this sum over some linear combination of NC, and this gives me an expression of this type. Okay? So I'm done. Okay. This I've explained. So So let me just insist on why all this construction is useful. So by this lemma, to prove that okay, I'm writing very badly, converges to some average f for all local functions, it is enough to show that, say, sigma A, of course, can do the same with NA, I will not state it. Indeed, it's really empty, but okay, let me still say it. We have that the expected value of f in this, well, I use the decomposition of f, which I've erased, the decomposition of f in terms of the sigma A, so it's the sum of all A in the support of f. Then I have f hat A, sigma A, but by linearity of the expected value, I can take the expected value inside, so I get sigma A beta h. But now we know that this guy converges to, if I have this, we know that this guy converges to the average of sigma A. And then by linearity of this thing, this has to converge to the, okay, f hat A sigma A, which is just, okay. Okay, so if you are able to show just convergence for this particular class of function, then you have convergence for all local functions. The same if you have the convergence for all the NAs, then you have for all local functions. So next week we are going to use that with these correlation inequalities that I already mentioned, these tools that allow you to prove inequalities for expected values of sigma A's and NAs, in order to prove that the plus state and minus states do indeed exist and have this translation invariance property that I have stated, plus some other properties that will turn out to be useful. Yes, I think we stop here for today. It's pointless to start something now. Are there questions about what we have done today? No? Good?